Bent Creek, Colorado Territory, autumn 1882. When rancher James Caldwell placed a simple advertisement in the Denver Post seeking a practical wife for his struggling cattle ranch, he expected someone desperate, weathered, or running from scandal. What arrived instead was Catherine Hayes, a woman in a faded calico dress whose gentle manner and educated speech seemed impossibly out of place on the harsh frontier. She carried secrets in her careful silences and grace in her worn hands. What began as a practical arrangement would reveal that sometimes the most unlikely people become exactly what we need, and that angels don't always arrive with wings. Sometimes they come in calico, carrying wounds that only love can heal. Chapter 1. The Advertisement and Arrival. November wind carried the scent of coming snow across the Colorado Territory, whistling through the gaps in James Caldwell's ranch house like a lonely hymn. The advertisement had run in the Denver Post for 3 weeks, buried between livestock auctions and mining equipment sales. Its words were plain and honest, offering no romance or false promises. Rancher seeks capable wife. Bent Creek, Colorado Territory. Must be hardy, practical, and willing to work. No children. A modest home is provided. Respond by telegram. James had written those lines by lamplight, his calloused fingers awkward around the pencil. At 34, he understood the brutal mathematics of frontier survival. His ranch sprawled across decent grazing land, but cattle prices had dropped. Winter approached with merciless certainty, and managing everything alone had worn him down to raw endurance. He needed help, not companionship. Partnership, not passion. 3 women had responded. The first telegram came from a widow in Kansas City with 4 children, despite his clear specification. The second arrived from someone who couldn't spell her own name correctly, which troubled him more than he wanted to admit. The third response came in neat handwriting on quality paper, brief but proper. Catherine Hayes, age 26, willing, arriving November 12th, afternoon train. That was all. No demands, no questions, no requests for money or promises. Just a name, an age, and a date. Something about that stark simplicity had convinced him. November 12th arrived cold and clear. James drove his wagon into Bent Creek just after noon, the town's single street bustling with Saturday commerce. The train whistle pierced the thin mountain air at 2 o'clock sharp, and he stood on the platform with his hat in his hands, scanning the handful of passengers who descended. She emerged from the passenger car, like something from another world. The calico dress caught his attention first, faded blue with tiny white flowers, patched at the elbows but clean and carefully mended. She carried a single carpet bag and moved with unconscious grace, her dark hair pinned neatly beneath a simple bonnet. When their eyes met across the platform, James felt something shift in his chest that he couldn't name. Catherine Hayes was beautiful, but it wasn't the kind of beauty that belonged on a rough cattle ranch. Her features held delicate refinement. Her hands looked soft despite obvious care, and when she spoke, her voice carried the cultured tones of Eastern education. Mr. Caldwell. She extended her hand with surprising directness. I am Catherine Hayes. Her handshake was firm, her gaze steady. Up close, James noticed shadows beneath her eyes and a tightness around her mouth that spoke of recent hardship. Whatever had driven her west hadn't been adventure or romance. She was running from something or towards something with the kind of quiet desperation that didn't announce itself in words. The ride to the ranch passed in careful conversation. She asked intelligent questions about the land, the cattle, and the winter preparations. He answered honestly about the isolation, the hard work, and the modest circumstances. She listened without complaint or visible disappointment, her gloved hands folded in her lap, her attention focused on the endless prairie stretching toward distant mountains. When the ranch house came into view, James watched her face carefully. The structure leaned slightly southward, weathered gray by mountain winds. The barn needed repairs. The corral fence sagged in places, and the whole property bore the unmistakable marks of a man who'd been fighting losing battles for too long. Catherine studied it all with unreadable expression, then spoke words that surprised him. The house had good bones, she observed quietly. The land held promise. Everything else was just work. Her practical assessment, delivered without judgment or false cheer, eased something tight in his shoulders. Inside, the house revealed its bachelor starkness. Functional furniture, minimal decoration, everything clean but utterly without warmth or personality. The stove worked, the roof didn't leak, and the windows had glass. These constituted James's standards for adequate housing. He showed her the spare room upstairs, small but private, with a narrow bed and a washstand. Catherine set down her carpet bag and removed her bonnet with deliberate care. When she turned to face him, her expression held something he hadn't expected, gratitude so profound it was almost painful to witness. That evening, they sat across from each other at the kitchen table, discussing practical arrangements with the formality of a business negotiation. He would pay for the justice of the peace to come out next week for a simple ceremony. She would handle the household management, cooking, mending, and garden work come spring. They would maintain separate rooms until both felt comfortable with closer arrangements. He would never raise his hand to her. She would never abandon him without warning. The terms were stated plainly, agreed to quietly, and sealed with nothing more than a nod. But as darkness settled over the ranch and Catherine moved about the kitchen preparing their simple supper, James found himself watching her with growing confusion. Nothing about her matched what he'd expected. She moved through his rough house like she belonged in a parlor somewhere, yet showed no disdain for its simplicity. Her hands worked with practiced competence despite their obvious unfamiliarity with such labor. When she served him stew and cornbread that tasted better than anything he'd made in years, James began to understand that Catherine Hayes carried mysteries far deeper than he'd anticipated. The question wasn't why she'd answered his advertisement. Plenty of women faced circumstances that drove them west. The question was why someone like her, with her obvious refinement and education, had ended up desperate enough to marry a stranger sight unseen. Chapter 2. The Angel in Calico. The first week passed in careful choreography. Catherine rose before dawn, her movements quiet in the pre-dawn darkness. By the time James came downstairs, coffee was already brewing and breakfast preparations were underway. She cooked simple meals but elevated them with unexpected touches. Herbs she'd found growing wild near the creek, bread that rose perfectly golden, stews seasoned with knowledge that suggested formal training. She never complained about the cold water, the drafty windows, or the isolation. Instead, she set about making small improvements with the materials at hand. Flour sacks became curtains. An old quilt was repurposed into chair cushions. She swept and scrubbed until the house gleamed, then started mending every piece of clothing James owned, her needle moving with the precision of someone who'd been taught by experts. But it was her other qualities that truly puzzled him. She read from a worn copy of Shakespeare during evening hours, her lips moving silently over words he only half understood. When they finally retired to their separate rooms, something had shifted again. Catherine was no longer just a refined woman who'd stepped off the train in faded calico. She was becoming real, complicated, damaged, brilliant, and mysteriously kind. And James was beginning to realize that whatever practical arrangement he'd thought he was making, the reality was far more complex than he'd imagined. Chapter 3. Secrets and Trust. Winter arrived with teeth. Snow fell in sheets that erased the horizon, and temperatures dropped until water froze in buckets overnight. The cattle huddled in sheltered draws while James fought daily battles to keep them fed and alive. Catherine proved tougher than she looked, helping him carry hay bales and break ice on frozen water troughs without complaint. But the isolation pressed close. Days passed when they saw no one, spoke to no one except each other. The forced proximity revealed truths that couldn't be hidden in careful politeness. Catherine's nightmares started the second week of December. James would wake to muffled sounds through the wall, crying that tried to be silent, gasping breaths that spoke of terror. The first time, he lay in his own bed, uncertain whether intervening would help or worsen things. The second time, he knocked softly on her door, asking if she was all right. Her response came shakily. Just dreams, she'd insisted, "Please forgive the disturbance." The third time, he didn't knock. He simply sat outside her door until the sounds quieted, a silent presence offering what protection he could provide. In the morning, she appeared at breakfast with red-rimmed eyes, but said nothing. Neither did he. The truth emerged gradually, like ice melting in spring. It started with small revelations. She mentioned a former engagement, spoken so casually it almost passed unnoticed. Then came references to her father's death and the debts he'd left behind. Pieces assembled themselves into a picture James hadn't wanted to imagine. One frozen afternoon, while they were both trapped inside by a blizzard, Catherine finally told the whole story. Her father had indeed been a professor, brilliant and respected. But he'd also been a gambler who'd hidden his addiction behind academic respectability. When he died suddenly, Catherine discovered he'd mortgaged everything. Their house, her small inheritance, even her promised dowry. The debts were staggering. Her fiancé, a promising young attorney from a good family, had ended their engagement immediately. Not because he didn't care for her, Catherine explained with brittle composure, but because his career depended on his reputation and association with scandal would have destroyed his prospects. His family had been polite but firm. They'd offered her money to leave Boston quietly. With no family, no income, and a name now associated with disgrace, Catherine had used that money to reinvent herself. She'd traveled west, where nobody knew her history, and had answered James's advertisement because it offered exactly what she needed, a fresh start in a place where the past couldn't reach her. She spoke without self-pity, stating facts with the same practical clarity she brought to everything. But her hands trembled slightly as she told it, betraying the cost of those composed words. James listened without interruption. Catherine's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. The acceptance of his words clearly reached places where judgment had once lived. When he asked if she regretted coming, her answer was immediate and fierce. She regretted nothing. This rough ranch, this hard life, this simple existence, it was more real and honest than anything she'd left behind. Something fundamental changed between them that day. The careful distance they'd maintained began to close. James found himself reaching for her hand when they walked to the barn through the snow. Catherine would touch his shoulder in passing, her gestures growing more natural. They began finishing each other's sentences, anticipating needs before they were spoken. One evening, Catherine asked about his own loneliness. Why hadn't he married before? James considered the question carefully. He'd loved someone once, he admitted, a girl from Missouri. But she'd wanted cities and society, while he needed open land and freedom. They'd parted without bitterness, simply acknowledging that they wanted different lives. He'd come west alone and had stayed alone because he'd never found anyone who understood why he'd chosen this hard path. Until now, he added quietly. Catherine understood. She'd chosen this life deliberately, with full knowledge of its hardships. That choice meant everything. Late that night, Catherine appeared at his door wearing her nightgown and shawl. She couldn't sleep, she explained softly, and didn't want to be alone. James made room on the settee by the dying fire. They sat together wrapped in blankets, her head eventually resting against his shoulder while snow continued falling outside. No words were necessary. They'd both been alone for too long, both carrying burdens that isolated them from easy connection. But here, in this small house buried in Colorado snow, they'd found something neither had expected. Not just partnership, but genuine understanding. The kind that grows between people who've stopped pretending to be anything other than exactly who they are. Chapter 4. Choosing Each Other. Spring transformed everything. Snow melted into rushing creeks, grass emerged green and new, and the cattle scattered across pastures with renewed energy. The ranch demanded constant attention, but James found himself working with renewed purpose. Catherine had planted a garden that was already showing promise, had improved their food stores through careful management, and had somehow made their modest house feel like a real home. But more than that, she'd become essential in ways that had nothing to do with practical arrangements. James caught himself watching for her smile, listening for her voice, seeking her opinion on decisions he'd always made alone. When she stood beside him on the porch in the evenings, Her presence felt as natural as breathing. The realization that he loved her came quietly, without drama or revelation. It was simply there one morning, as obvious and undeniable as sunrise. He'd fallen in love with the way she hummed while cooking, the fierce intelligence in her questions, the strength it had taken to rebuild her life from ruins. He loved her courage, her kindness, her refusal to be defeated by circumstances that would have crushed someone weaker. But they still maintained separate rooms, still treated their marriage as the practical arrangement it had begun as. James didn't know if Catherine felt anything beyond gratitude and friendship. He was afraid to ask, afraid to risk the comfortable partnership they built. The truth emerged, as truths do, through accident rather than design. In late April, while helping repair the barn roof, James slipped on wet wood and fell. The drop wasn't far, but he landed badly, his ankle twisting with a sickening crack. The pain was immediate and overwhelming. Catherine found him there, unable to stand, cursing his own clumsiness. She didn't panic. Instead, she assessed the damage with calm efficiency, then organized his transport to the house with a combination of ingenuity and sheer determination. She wrapped his ankle with expert care, made him comfortable, and took over the ranch work without hesitation. For 2 weeks, Catherine managed everything: the cattle, the garden, the house, and his injury. She rose before dawn and worked until dark, her refined hands developing calluses and rope burns. She never complained, never showed frustration, never suggested this was beyond what she'd agreed to do. She simply did whatever needed doing. James watched her from his forced confinement, seeing clearly what had been obvious all along. She hadn't just accepted this life, she'd embraced it completely. The woman who'd arrived in faded Calico had transformed into someone stronger and more remarkable than he'd imagined possible. She belonged here, not because circumstances had driven her west, but because she'd chosen to build something real from the fragments of her shattered life. One evening, as she changed his bandages with gentle hands, James finally spoke what he'd been holding back. He was grateful she'd answered his advertisement. He said carefully, but that wasn't why he wanted her to stay. He wanted her to stay because he loved her, because she'd become more important than the ranch, more necessary than success, more precious than anything else in his life. Catherine went very still, her hands frozen on the bandage. When she looked up, tears streamed freely down her face. She'd been afraid. She confessed that he still saw her as an obligation, as the refined woman he'd helped out of pity. But she loved him too, loved his honesty, his strength, his kindness that never demanded recognition. She loved this life they were building, loved the person she'd become in this place, loved him with an intensity that terrified her because she'd lost everything once and couldn't bear to lose him too. James pulled her close then, and she came willingly, both of them clinging to each other with the desperation of people who'd been alone too long. When he kissed her, it carried all the tenderness and passion that had been building for months, and when she kissed him back, it was with equal measure of both. That night, Catherine didn't return to her separate room. They lay together in his narrow bed, wrapped around each other while spring wind whispered through the eaves, both finally understanding that what had started as a practical arrangement had become something far greater, a genuine partnership built on respect, strengthened by hardship, and blessed by love that neither had expected to find. The advertisement had sought a capable wife for practical purposes. What James had found instead was Catherine, an angel in Calico who'd brought grace to his rough life, intelligence to his simple world, and love to his lonely heart. She'd come west running from ruin and had found redemption. He'd sought help and had found his home finally complete. They built their life together through seasons of hardship and plenty, through droughts and abundant years, through all the challenges that frontier life demanded. The ranch prospered under their combined efforts. Catherine's education proved invaluable for managing accounts and making sound business decisions, while James's practical skills kept everything running. They were equal partners in every sense, each bringing strengths that complemented the other perfectly. Years later, when travelers asked how they'd met, They would simply smile and say he'd placed an advertisement for a practical wife and gotten an angel instead. Catherine would laugh and correct him. She'd been no angel, just a woman desperate enough to answer a stranger's ad and fortunate enough to find a man who saw her value when the world had declared her worthless. But James knew the truth. Whatever Catherine Hayes had been when she stepped off that train in her faded calico dress, she transformed into exactly what he needed without knowing to ask for it. Not just a capable partner, but someone who understood that sometimes the greatest blessings arrive disguised as practical arrangements, and that love grows strongest when it's built on the solid foundation of choosing each other every single day. If this story of unexpected love on the Colorado frontier touched your heart, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments what surprised you most about Catherine and James's journey. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next story.